Today we have Bruce Afferman. He is an accomplished legal profession with a significant impact in civil rights and the constitutional law. He actually also represents the ICC case against Museveni and his son.
Museveni mu ICC ne sanctions ezigenda mu maaso ezitagatinga Museveni ng'ono ye looya we ayogera ku nsonga zino wa we zituuse wa we batuusizza olutalo luno olw'okugezaako okwemamulako nakyemalira olw'okugezaako okulabisa nakyemalira mawanga g'abazungu olutalo luno lunene naye nga ono akoze kyamaanyi nnyo His Excellency Kyagulanyi Ssentamu ku bintu ebigenda mu maaso. Ono nno munnamateeka omutendeke era nga tali nga bannayuganda bano bannakigwanyizi abeegwanyiza obwegwanyiza abali obuli ssente wabula munnamateeka ate nga mukozi akola ekintu mu butuufu bwakyo nga bwe kiba kiteekeddwa okubeera. Tuli live naye agezaako tunnyonnyolako ku nsonga ez'enjawulo okusinziira Musango guno weba ogutuuse ogwa ICC. Abakulembeze bangi bagezezzaako okuteeka nakyemalira mu ICC naye ng'agulirira omusango ne guvaayo. Naye ku mulundi guno omusango gukyagaanye kitegeeza omusango guno bagukwasizza maanyi era katusuubire nti tujja kugufunamu ekyo ekirungi kye twagala kubanga nakyemalira azoganyizza nnyo bannayuganda abaliisizza nnyo akakanja ye ssaawa naye asasulire ku ebyo byatuusizza ku bannayuganda. Mwami Museveni waali awulira abugumye kubanga omusango guno asindise abantu bangi bagezeeko okugubuzaabuza naye gukyagaanye. Kati batunnyonnyole munnamateeka ono atunnyonnyola ku ngeri omusango guno bwe gutambula nawa we gutuuse kubanga tuli bamalirivu tukimanyi nti omusango guno tujja sobola okuguggusa gujja sobola okuwangulwa. Mwami Museveni yayitibwa dda mu lukiiko luno olwa ICC.
Again today, and JB does a great job in running this show.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce, for that. Now, getting started. On the 30th of this past month, that's April, this year, the United Kingdom imposed sanctions on the Speaker of Parliament of Uganda, that is Anita Among, and 2 other former ministers for corruption and misappropriation of iron sheets meant for the poor people in Karamoja. Could you provide an insight into the legal implications and the potential consequences for the individuals involved, both in terms of their personal status and their ability to carry out their duties and functions within the government?
Well, JB, as a lawyer, sometimes people say we can't be brief, but I'll try to do both, explain and be brief as well. These sanctions are very important because it really represents the first time the UK has taken firm action against Uganda's government. Now, they didn't bring sanctions against Museveni or his son, but Speaker Among is among the highest people within the NRM and in the governing party apparatus, and this is an important statement. Now, it's interesting, JB, the parliament representative in Uganda said, oh, this is about the anti-homosexuality law. This is Britain's way of objecting to that. I don't think that's what's happening here, and I don't think Britain would bring sanctions against the Speaker of Parliament simply because of that. I think we have to look at what's really going on. They're charged with corruption about taking metal from a community construction program. I don't think the UK would get involved in that unless it was trying to send a stronger message. So first of all, JB, these sanctions are very serious. Anyone sanctioned, and the 2 ministers and Speaker Among, can no longer do any business in the UK. They can no longer send or receive any money through through UK banks. They can't go to the UK or any UK territories. That will probably be honored by places like Canada and Australia as well. They are unable to do any business of any kind with anyone within the United Kingdom. So this is a very serious ban. They can't travel even to the UK. Now, for a leader in a Commonwealth country like Uganda, that's a serious burden. Now, undoubtedly, the EU will also begin to look at serious travel restraints, as will the US as to these people. Now, let's examine what's really happening here. Would the UK have done this just because of sheet metal that's taken from a community construction program? I don't think so. I think what's happening here is something more serious. You know, just last year, or early in the year, the US struck off Uganda from the AGOA, special preference for African agricultural products. And the stated reason was very blunt, because of the human rights violations. And this wasn't just a sanction against a few officials. Uganda itself is now taken out of AGOA because President Biden said its human rights record violates international law. So that's very important. So I think this is the UK's way of following on that and sending a message to Museveni and Muhoozi that we're no longer going to be tolerating this kind of conduct by Uganda. We're going to start to crack down. And I think this is the UK's way of answering both what President Biden did and what we did in the ICC. We documented hundreds of cases of torture against NUP members, against ordinary citizens. And I think the UK is now responding to that. They don't want to so directly burn the bridges yet, but they're using this sheet metal as a way of sending a signal that the worm is turning, and Museveni needs to know that.
Bruce, following the imposition of sanctions, the Uganda government stated recently its intention to engage with the United Kingdom regarding the rationale behind these actions. Now, we would love to know, is there a possibility for sanctions to be reversed? And if so, under what conditions or terms could this occur? Because if they are ready to engage, definitely, maybe there is a possibility that the sanctions can be reversed.
Well, JB, I think that's Uganda's government saying we want to talk to the UK. But the UK didn't talk to Uganda first. It issued the sanctions under the UK Global Anti-Corruption Act. So Uganda may want to talk to the UK about the rationale behind the sanctions, but that doesn't mean the UK is going to speak to Uganda. I think that's a very important distinction. The UK would not have done this if it was prepared to negotiate and remove these later. I think the UK government would be very embarrassed if it backed out so quickly, especially when the US has sanctioned the entire agricultural industry in Uganda because of the government's human rights record. I don't think the UK is going to back down.
Crossing over to the United States, in its country report on Uganda, the United States Department of State documents the extensive crackdown on leaders and supporters of NUP by the Museveni regime. The report highlights the extrajudicial killing of NUP supporters, including Mzee Costa Muhonja, who was tortured to death in February while in police custody. It also details incidents of the abduction, torture, and detention without trial of NUP supporters like Olivia Lutaya on politically motivated charges. However, the report couldn't capture all details, as some are still ongoing and being documented. Like a few weeks ago, an activist by the name Masaba Faustin was abducted and is still held in Communicado. Bruce, could this human rights report on Uganda support calls for additional sanctions? Can it be used as a tool to call for sanctions? Does it meet the criteria for such action? And if so, what legal avenues could be pursued?
Well, JP, I think the report itself is a very important development. The U.S. has been a close ally of Uganda under Museveni. Museveni is a part of the U.S. military strategy in Africa and even in Iraq to a degree. And the Uganda military has been close to the U.S. But now the U.S. is starting to seriously distance itself from Uganda. You know, the Biden withdrawal from AGOA. Now the Human Rights Report, which really is a very strong condemnation. And all of this follows, well, the Human Rights Report follows our ICC submission. Now, I want to point out something to everyone listening. The U.S. does not have our ICC affidavits. Those are confidential. And everyone who gave those to us, they do not go to any other government, they go to the ICC. So the U.S. was working on its own information, which was very strong as well. So I think this shows, JB, that the U.S. is now getting tougher and is going to push harder as to Uganda. And this is very significant because in the next election, Uganda is going to find it much harder to commit fraud and get away with it. If the Biden administration is now doing these two things, withdrawing Uganda from the African Agricultural Preference Program, which is vital to Uganda because Uganda is an agricultural country, and then it issues a country report condemning very grossly these human rights violations, I think that means that if Museveni attempts to defraud the electorate again, the United States is actually not going to accept that. JB, these two developments are very important. Removing Africa from the Agricultural Preference Program, that's a major blow. Removing Uganda, that's a major blow. Uganda is an agricultural country. And one of the easiest things it can export is agricultural products. And then the country report, which completely condemns the human rights violations. Now, the U.S. doesn't have all of the detail we have and that we gave to the ICC. But the U.S. report is still pretty broad and blunt and condemns Uganda's government outright. These two things tell us that the next time there's an election, and it's going to be coming up, Museveni is not going to be easily able to get away with committing a fraudulent election return. The U.S. is demonstrating now, it's now willing to distance itself from Uganda's government, and it's not going to accept a fraudulent election the next time around. And that vote's going to get closer and closer, and it's going to be much harder for Museveni to defraud the voters this time. And the U.S. is not going to be quietly accepting that. I want to add one more thing, JB. You remember when the violence just before the last election in November 2020 took place? That was in the last months of Donald Trump's presidency. President Trump at the time directed the Secretary of State to issue a very strong condemnation of the abuses that we saw in the end of the campaign in the last election. Then the Biden administration came in and it took time to get back on track, but now it's getting tougher again. If President Trump comes back, I think Museveni is going to find he has a very strong opponent in office because President Trump, just before he left office, issued a very strong condemnation as to human rights abuses by the Museveni government. And if President Trump comes back, we're going to see a much tougher U.S. policy. And we may be able to see the beginning of the end of this regime. And President Biden, as we see, is also becoming tougher as well. There's less and less tolerance in the U.S. for this kind of abusive government.
Yes, Bruce. Could you please throw more light on the issue of using the Human Rights Report on Uganda as a tool to call for more sanctions on targeted individuals?
Oh, yes, certainly. Thank you, JB, for reminding me on that additional issue. The report itself is the basis for sanctions in the U.S. Human rights abuses in the U.S. lead directly to sanctions. Unlike other countries, our laws allow human rights abuses to be the basis for very severe sanctions. And those include complete inability to use the U.S. banking system, and that really means the world banking system, because really the U.S. controls access to most international banks, no travel to the United States, no business in the U.S. So anyone put under those sanctions basically is out of business, and any individual or company. So the new report, the new Human Rights Report, absolutely provides a basis for those additional sanctions. And it also tells us the US is going to continue to work in that direction, because these reports are always updated. As you just pointed out, with the loss of Museveni Faustin.
Yeah, Museveni Faustin.
We see more and more cases arising. And so the US pays attention to those. The next report is going to be even tougher. And so that report absolutely can be the basis for sanctions. Eventually, frankly, I think Museveni himself will be subject to those sanctions, because it's clear who is issuing the orders and who is running this operation. Now, we already identified that General Muhoozi, in three separate instances, has been identified as being the director of the government's torture operation. And that's been submitted to the ICC. That eventually can be given to the United States Department of State, and they could very seriously examine that evidence and consider sanctions against General Muhoozi. So the fact that Britain and the US are both ratcheting up the pressure, this tells us that this regime is going to be in trouble.
Yes, of course, we can swear it's heading the sanctions, decide the human rights reports on Uganda, and then the ICC. Actually, Bruce, the last time you were here, you hinted on the name Anita Mong as one of those dragged to the International Criminal Court. Now, here comes fresh sanctions against the same person from the United Kingdom, moreover. I want you to elaborate briefly, what good does this serve to the case at the ICC, because you are at the forefront of this?
Well, you know, it's interesting that on their face, the sanctions are about stealing metal. So it doesn't directly relate to human rights abuses. But it's obviously been issued not because of the metal, but because of the human rights situation. This is the UK's way of making a starting point. And I think the ICC will understand that point. And the combination of the US and the UK sanctions and reports will, I think, be important to the ICC in evaluating this. So we'll be actually supplementing at the appropriate time our papers to bring that forward to the ICC. I think this will be very important to the ICC. Now, we also have to remember the ICC is a unique court. It doesn't have unlimited resources. It spent a great deal of time on Ukraine and still is. It's now apparently looking carefully at events in Gaza and in Israel, and with respect to the Hamas attacks as well. And so they take their time, they have to. But they are going to look at our papers, they are looking at our papers, and that process will continue. And it's a powerful tool, because the leaders of Uganda know that these bodies, these courts, these governments are looking after them, out for them. And not to protect them, but the worm is turning. These leaders in Uganda are now on the defensive, and we can see that happening more and more through all of these different actions. So I believe this will be very important